Hello and welcome to Anakut. This is Andrew Hafner and I'm one of the hosts of the show. If you've been listening to us for a while, welcome back. If you're new, thanks for tuning in. This episode in particular is a great time to join us. We'll be debuting a new format for the show. We wanted to keep things fresh for this, our third season, and so we brought the series out into the world, out of the studio for a reported, more narrative kind of style. It's a little experimental for us and we've not tried anything like this before. And we really hope you like it. This episode will also be the first of a two-parter looking at the kingdom's economic relationship with China. It's a topic of great importance here in modern Cambodia. It's something that is never far from domestic news, and it's one that we wanted to explore with this series. But before we get too far into that, I want to introduce my co-host, Valek. Hi, Valek. How are you?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for the introduction. So far, so good for me. This episode you're listening to will now delve into the Belt and Road Initiative, a major act of Chinese foreign policies. You've probably heard about it before, but we'll be getting into what it is, what it means for Cambodia, and where it seems to be going in the future. In recent months, analysts have described the BRI declining as it was a massive, hard infrastructure-focused campaign and becoming something a little less ambitious or perhaps just more targeted in scope. As some real quick backgrounds on the BRI so it's clear what we're talking about, this is a major overseas investment initiative launched in 2013, initially as the One Belt One Road. It mostly includes infrastructure projects such as roads, ports, and trains, but it can also include things like the Sihanoukville Special Economic Zone. So the actual definition of BRI projects is fuzzy, which we'll talk about more in a second. We don't want to pin us to a set number of how many of these projects are out there in the world, but we read estimates of between 2 to 3,000, so we'll go with that for now. Cambodia is just one country of many countries around the world with ongoing projects.
So to understand what this initiative means for Cambodia, we've spoken with policy analysts both in the country and beyond, as well as gone for some field work around key sites of BRI activity. Today we're going to mostly talk about the new expressway running between Phnom Penh and Sihanoukville on the coast. That's where the country's only deep water port is. It's been the site of a lot of hopes and plans to make a second major city and economic hub. And unfortunately, it's been a bit of a poster child for the negative effects of uncontrolled Chinese investment related to some flagship BRI projects. In recent years, the city has been in the news as a center for online gambling, cyber scams, and forced labor related to those two things. But we'll get more into that in the next episode. We actually, as a team, went down on the expressway to Sihanoukville about a month or so ago, and we all found it pretty good. It's a nice road, looks quite professional. Now, in the process of actually sourcing the land and building it, there were numerous rights issues associated with acquiring the property to actually construct this road, particularly on the western edge of Phnom Penh, where the entrance is on this side. Residents said they weren't given enough compensation for their land, refused to hand over their property, and were eventually forced out in the end by officials who demolished their homes and businesses. Now, we went and spoke with people in that area to hear what they think of the expressway now that it's done. We'll hear more from them later on in the episode, but for now we can say their reviews are mixed. From one woman who seemed pretty traumatized by the demolitions to small business owners who were more or less apathetic about it. Before we jump into that, we wanted to take a step back and talk about what the Belt and Road Initiative, which we've been calling the BRI, what it is, and also what it isn't. So to help us understand that, we spoke with some analysts. You're first going to hear from China Public Policy Fellow Hong Zhang from the Harvard Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. She studies the BRI and has worked on a project called the People's Map of Global China, which helps us keep track of investments that fall under the BRI rubric. At the same time, Zhang said lists like this aren't actually so clear.
Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion about what really is a BRI in the context of Cambodia. What is a BRI project in Cambodia? The answer actually is there's no official BRI project. There's a lot of ongoing projects, a lot of projects that have been going on for some time, and the companies, especially the Chinese companies involved in these projects, be them state-owned companies or private companies, they try very hard to brand their projects as some kind of related to BRI or contribute to BRI, etc., in order to gain legitimacy and also to show that they have connections they have power, they have influence, but a lot of times it's just the company's branding. So it's really not about Chinese government making public investment programs or plans in Cambodia, and they have identified project 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not like that.
What is a BRI project? Like, how do we...
In general.
Yeah, is there a definition that we can use? Are there guidelines to identify them? Yeah, how do we draw that line?
Yeah, I think that's been the question that most of researchers have been thinking about since the beginning of BRI. But I think what I can say by now is that BRI really is it's almost like a campaign. Of course, it started with Xi launching this initiative with one of the primary goals is to really enhance the economic ties, infrastructure connectivities with other countries, especially in the neighborhood, and also calling for all kinds of investment and economic initiative from China's local governments and from also Chinese companies. So you can think of it as a rally call. And of course, there are some financial arrangements that are supposedly helping to finance some of the projects that are considered associated with BRI. For example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has been frequently mentioned, the Silk Road Funds. So there are some mechanisms, and a lot of times they do invest in very high-profile projects that are very much central to the economic diplomacy or diplomatic outreach by the Chinese government to the other countries. But still, it's very hard to give a definition of what is a BRI project. So it's quite confusing. So we can only say that some projects in some countries, they have been included in some kind of bilateral government agreements that they would promote these projects. They would do a lot of things. The governments would try to help with these projects, facilitate the realization of these projects. But there's no one specific funding mechanism or one specific arrangement or program with all the BRI projects around the world. So I think that's something that's often not very well understood.
Hong's analysis is useful to remember when we talk about different Chinese-backed projects through this episode. We choose to focus on the Sihanouk Expressway since it's a good example of what these projects are intended to look like here. Some background on the expressway: it's the first ever built in Cambodia. It was constructed by China Road and Bridge Corporation through the Cambodian Phnom Penh Sihanouk Expressway Co. Ltd. at a cost of about $2 billion US. The developers are quite active in general in Cambodia. They've worked on a lot of projects here, and they were selected by the Cambodian Ministry of Public Works and Transportation to do the expressway. The developers paid the cost of the road under a build, operate, transfer agreement. All that really means is that the Chinese company paid for the projects and will be responsible for its operation. The CRBC has a 50 years lease to operate the expressway and to make profit off its tolls. At the end of that period, ownership of the road will transfer to the Cambodian government. Workers broke ground on the road in 2019 and finished construction last year. The road opened last year on October 1st and has gotten mostly favorable reviews from users so far. It's a toll road. It runs for 187 kilometers and effectively cuts the time to get between the cities in half, from about 5 to 6 hours to just about 2.5. In late February, the Ministry of Public Works and Transportation reported the toll road had 1.9 million users, generating about $11 million in its first 4 months of operations. Only cars, trucks, and motorcycles above 550 cc's are allowed on the road, which means no scooters or smaller bikes. That rules out most of the vehicles you see in Cambodia. Though there were some viral photos on social media of people trying to bring buffalo and other animals on the road before it officially opened. It seems the access rules are also being enforced pretty well.
Now, there have been a lot of players involved in this project in different ways and at different times besides the CRBC. I also saw there was a Malaysian firm called Min Consult, which was involved with the expressway, and the deal between the Cambodian government and CRBC was brokered by a U.S. law firm called Hunton and Williams. The feasibility study for the road was done by the Japanese International Aid Organization, JICA, from 2006 to 2018. So this was actually in the works long before the BRI was first announced. As Zhang said, that's pretty common for these kinds of projects. What also seems common with these projects, especially in Cambodia, is a certain opaqueness, not exactly transparent from the start. Sometimes we only hear about them when they make it through in government-friendly media or in speeches from officials. We heard that from other researchers.
So my name is Suvinda Po. I am a lecturer in international relations at the Institute for International Studies and Public Policy of the Royal University of Phnom Penh. And at the same time, I have my affiliation with the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. I am a senior research fellow there. So basically, my research focuses more on international relations in Southeast Asia, and especially its relationship with major powers like China.
But even for researchers with a specific interest in this subject, there were limitations for what could be said.
How easy is it to access information about these projects?
It's very hard. It's very hard. The nature of the Chinese projects is that they don't really disclose the information. So it's very hard for us to really get detailed information about each particular project. So far, what we have learned and known is through the media reports. Other than that, its websites do not contain any detailed information that we are looking for. So simply put, it's very difficult. Everywhere, not just in Cambodia. It's the nature of Chinese doing businesses.
From everything we've heard from our analysts, we do know that there is a lot of cooperation between Cambodia and China to build these kinds of projects that we deem to be under the BRI, even if there's kind of a bottom-up mechanism for some of them, as in people wanted to do a project on their own and they saw an opportunity to make it part of the BRI by saying it's part of the BRI. There are things that the governments have worked out. As Sovinda mentioned, a lot of what we know about the initiative in Cambodia comes from press releases or coverage by local government-aligned media outlets. From what we do know from the sources already mentioned, Prime Minister Hun Sen has a very ambitious vision for infrastructure development throughout the country. Sovinda says these projects are key for the larger goal of becoming a middle-income country by 2030 and a high-income country by 2050.
That's the goal of the Cambodian government, set out very clear from the very start. And BRI projects can come in and contribute to the realization of these goals. So that's why we've seen the enthusiastic impress of the BRI projects coming in from either by the Chinese state-owned enterprises or through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So this is quite significant impress regarding the BRI projects.
The Prime Minister has called for a broad slate of projects, and he's asked his Chinese counterparts for help in funding or researching feasibility to put various things in the ground in the next couple years. He's even stated that Cambodia should move quickly to put these things in motion while still regarded as a low-income country. Once the economy grows and becomes a middle-income country, he said, the necessary loans and financing might get more expensive. People also might be less willing to provide grants and other forms of easier funding to work with. The Prime Minister has also regularly instructed Public Works and Transport Minister Sun Chantol to prioritize various projects. So there are a ton of things in some stage of the process, and though most are still in feasibility study, others are currently happening or seem about ready to break ground.
We'll go through some of those now. First, the government wants to build 3 more expressways over about the next decade. The first one of those is already scheduled to be built, connecting Phnom Penh to Ba Wat on the Vietnam border. Work could start by this June and finish by the end of 2026 or early 2027, at a total cost of about $1.7 billion. That would include a $200 million bridge to cross the Mekong River in Phnom Penh, which is something the government has wanted for a long time. That would apparently be in addition to the Cambodia-Korea Friendship Bridge that would cross the river through Trojong Ba. CRBC is also working on feasibility studies for an expressway to connect the capital to Siem Reap and another to Pai Pat on Thai border.
Besides the expressways, Hun Sen has also announced ambitions to boost the country's rail system, both with high-speed intercity linkages that would upgrade or add to existing lines, possibly even with a metro system for Phnom Penh. Cambodia currently has a total of 3 rail lines. 2 of these run, respectively, from Phnom Penh to Sihanoukville in Poi Phet on the Thai border, and the third connects the capital to its airport, though that one doesn't actually run anymore and had a lot of issues in the past. The Poi Phet line has also had problems over the years, though Cambodia and Thailand have shown recent interest in making rail travel between the countries an easier possibility once again. CRBC is conducting feasibility studies for these rail projects. The line to Poi Pet, from what we know so far, would come in at an estimated $4 billion, would theoretically take about 4 years to build, and would run over 382 kilometers. I've not yet seen a price tag for the route to Sihanoukville, but if it helps our estimate at all, it would be considerably shorter than the one to Poi Pet. It appears that the inspiration for these rail lines is partly the high-speed rail up in Laos, which now connects the capital of Vientiane to the Chinese city of Kunming. Transport Minister Sun Chantol referenced the train in Laos in remarks to the industry publication Construction and Property, saying the Cambodian trains could match its speeds of 160 kilometers per hour. Minister Chantol has stated that he's seeking private investors for the railway upgrades as part of a larger cross-country goal of connecting Cambodia to China through Thailand and Laos. As for the possibility of someday having a subway system in Phnom Penh, the Prime Minister has ordered Chantol to focus on studying that. The Public Works and Transport Chief said the China Communications Construction Company, which is the parent of CRBC, is working on the feasibility study. So we've talked about roads and rails, but as we rattle through this list of projects, we wanted to mention the airports. We'll talk briefly about two major airport projects in the works, which are the new international ones for Phnom Penh and Siem Reap. Construction in Siem Reap began in 2020, and the airport is expected to start accepting test flights next month, in May. It cost about $880 million to build and was bankrolled by the Yunnan Investment Group, based out of the Chinese city of the same name. The Phnom Penh airport is the big one, literally. It'll take up about 2,600 hectares of land, making it the 9th largest airport in the world by area at a cost of about $1.5 billion. Work started in 2019, and its first phase is supposed to be finished sometime next year. The project is overseen by the Overseas Cambodian Investment Corporation, OCIC, in partnership with a subsidiary of China State Construction Engineering in the Metallurgical Corporation of China, which designed the airfield. If that second one doesn't sound immediately familiar, it is a subsidiary of the China Metallurgical Group Corporation, also known as MCC, which has a lot of ongoing projects here. One of its other subsidiaries was a contractor on the Dara Sakor project on the southern coast, which is a large, somewhat enigmatic resort-type thing. That's not necessarily a typical Belt and Road Initiative project, but it helps to show the range that these projects can take.
While China seems happy for now to work with Cambodia on this major agenda of infrastructure development, analysts say Chinese BRI investments elsewhere seems to be getting less ambitious. Parts of it is that Chinese developers have contributed to projects in parts of the world that just didn't work out. In some countries with more troubled economic balance sheets, especially Sri Lanka and Pakistan, BRI projects led to some accuse China of setting up the debt trap, of bankrolling projects that its recipient couldn't pay off. While Hong, Swenda, and others we spoke with didn't see the debt trap claim as fair, they are among a much wider consensus, forming that China seems less interested in the super ambitious projects of the past. The next few years, they think, could see China's BRI taking a softer tone, possibly looking more like the Western-backed development project we see in Cambodia and elsewhere, focusing on human development and capacity building in areas such as health and education.
But the trap, as it was in the way it was originally framed, it was really not grounded in fact. Of course, the reason why this discourse became so popular is also that China is partly to blame because a lot of the Chinese funded projects overseas ended up as for the white elephant projects. They don't really work well in terms of their economic viability, in terms of their greater social economic impact. So a lot of money was wasted, and as a result, a lot of countries also had a very heightened debt levels. That's also why China in recent years also cut back a lot of lending to other countries, because I think there's a realization that a lot of the past practices were very problematic and they need to change. So now that we're not going to see that many big announcements or big projects, I think it could also mean that a lot of the momentum that we saw in the past years probably is going to be lost, even if there are going to be some other smaller projects, socio-economic projects. I think it's just going to be very different, and I'm not sure it's going to make as much a difference as before.
Part of what we've been thinking as we reported this episode is something that the government often invokes here, that development naturally has winners and losers in its disruption. For most things here, that's used more as a deflection from criticism and allegations of corruption, as the gains of development are highly concentrated among the political and social elite. However, in seeing these infrastructure projects, that logic of winners and losers does seem to make more sense. Both the expressway and the new airport in Phnom Penh sparked land conflicts with people who lost property to make way for construction. And while it's easy to see the potential upsides of these new pieces of infrastructure, projects like this seem destined to cause more conflicts in the near future, unless the government can sort out some of the underlying problems with land tenure and other rights. So we spent a few hours at the expressway ramp on the edge of Phnom Penh to speak with residents there about their experience with the construction and their hopes for the road now that it's completed. The most affected person that we found was a woman who had a dwelling pretty much right on the ramp, and she didn't want to talk on record. She cried as she recounted the demolition of her home, which she said happened in the very early hours of the morning while her daughter was still inside. Nobody was hurt, but it was clearly a terrible experience for her and her family, and their current home is very awkwardly wedged in a way that makes it really difficult for most people to reach. Other people we spoke with were tentatively optimistic about the change or mostly apathetic. They were unsure about how it would affect them directly, aside from already lost profits during the height of construction, and mostly they seemed like they were waiting to see what happens next.
I only hope that construction is completed so it is easy for my business. There are other residents who live around the roundabout who protested regarding the expressway. I also protested, but it didn't go anywhere. So I chose to just go along with the government because I want our country to be developed like other developed nations.
So with that, we can wrap up today's episode of Anakut. We hope you found our discussion on Chinese investment in Cambodia informative and thought-provoking. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, we welcome your feedback and suggestions for the future episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. Until next time, goodbye.
This has been an episode of the Anakut podcast, which is a program of Globe Media Asia. The program is sponsored by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and is hosted by yours truly, plus Tina and Volek. As always, we are produced by Jan Muller, aka Professor Kinski.